Hello and welcome to Atheists Talk. My name is James Zimmerman. I'm going to be your host for this episode, and this is part two in a two-part episode where we're talking about the results of the 2012 election and how they affect atheists, or pretty much all people who are unaffiliated with religion. To help us sort through that, we have David Pacheco with us. He is a board member with the Minnesota Chapter of Americans United for separation of church and state. Welcome again, David.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just pick up where we were last time. We talked about some of the candidates who were rejected or accepted because of various things. We talked about how the religiously unaffiliated made up a large voting bloc, and that they need to be taken into consideration by politicians or political hopefuls, I should say. But let's move into moving away from political figures and into actual measures that were on ballots regarding altering constitutions at state levels. You had some things you were going to bring out about that?
Yeah, 2012 was an interesting year for that. They weren't a huge amount, but we believe that socially they were very significant, and the results are going to have a huge impact on coming years. We did see some measures that came around on November 6th, but also some measures that came out throughout the year as well. So for example, in Florida we had Amendment 8, and that was called the Religious Freedom Amendment 8. That one was defeated. It was defeated. They only got about 40%, less than 40% of the vote. They required 60%. They actually got 44%. Now, this is an amendment that would have actually eliminated the Florida Constitution's no aid provision, which is sometimes referred to as the Blaine Amendment. That prevents public funds, taxpayer money, from being used directly or indirectly in the aid of any church or sect or religious denomination or in aid of any sectarian institution. So it was pushed very, very strongly by the state Catholic hierarchy and various religious right organizations. And we like the fact that it actually only passed in 6 out of the 67 counties.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it was problematic because it would have allowed taxpayer money to flow directly to religious schools or ministries or houses of worship. So again, one of the principles that we work on in Americans United is that we don't want people's money going to religious organizations that they don't support. And when you have taxpayer money going in support of these organizations, you are violating the basic principles of separation. It would have stripped religious freedom protections that are currently enshrined in the Florida Constitution, and would have allowed for direct funding of religious institutions by taxpayer money. And most of the work actually to defeat that was performed by the local Americans United and the National Americans United offices out in Florida. So we were pretty happy about that one. There was another one in Florida that had a lot of religious undertones and overtones, which was Amendment 6. And this was the abortion amendment, and it was defeated. It got about 45% of the vote. This one would have prohibited the use of public funds for abortions except as required by federal law or to save the mother's life. And it also stipulates that the state constitution cannot be interpreted to include broader rights to abortion than those that are included in the U.S. Constitution. Now, the problem with this one in particular is that it would have allowed politicians to interfere with a woman's right to make decisions about their reproductive health. And really the biggest concern is imposing religious definitions of what the meaning of life is. So when does life begin? It's a very problematic definition. Obviously in this country we have very different opinions. There are groups, including our own Senator Bachmann, who propose on a regular basis the right to life changes to current law, which will state that conception marks the beginning of life. For religious reasons, is really at the end of the day why they're saying that. And it causes a lot of problems because it would make a large amount of contraceptive measures illegal because they end up being defined as abortion. So we're very happy that those did not pass. Those are the two most significant ones with regards to church and state separation that we saw.
And they were both in Florida.
And they were both in Florida. Yeah.
You know, my father lives in Florida, and he used to have a mug that says life begins at 30, so he would be in stark contrast to Michelle Bachmann regarding...
Yes, so well after conception.
Yeah.
That's 30 years.
So if he ever pushes that for religious reasons to get that on the Constitution, we might have another problem.
We'll use that mug as our main talking point.
All right. All right, but we had more in other states that had to do with marriage equality.
Yes, and marriage equality for us is, we consider, a significant religious separation of church and state issue. Because in the cases where we see the opposition, they tend to come from places like in the state of Minnesota, the Catholic Church and the Knights of Columbus, Catholic affiliated organization. We believe that imposing one definition of marriage that has a basis in a religious description or a religious definition, it's not the right thing to do, to enshrine that in the state constitution. It's not the right thing to put that in law, because that is saying this definition of religion, this religious definition of marriage is the one that shall be imposed on everybody, including people who don't believe that, including people, as multiple members of the MN United coalition did in the state of Minnesota, religious organizations who want to have same-sex marriage, who want to be able to have those in their church. It does not offend their religious beliefs. They welcome it. Putting something like that in the Constitution to prohibit same-sex marriage forever would be against their religious beliefs. Imposing one particular group's religious thought about what the definition of marriage is on the people that didn't accept it. And interestingly enough, we had a couple of other states where these marriage equality issues came up. Maryland, question 6, which was to approve or reject the Civil Marriage Protection Act, which was passed by the General Assembly in Maryland in February of 2012. This allows same-sex couples to obtain a civil marriage license and protect any religious institutions from having to perform any particular marriage which violates their religious beliefs. And that was one of the core principles, again, of separation here. It's not just not allowing the government to, not allowing a religious institution to impose a particular definition of marriage. It's also telling the government, you cannot come into a religious institution and force anyone to perform a same-sex marriage if your religion opposes it. It was one of the advertisements, or one of the implications of the advertising that came out in some of these states, that you will be forced, your religious organization will be forced to perform these marriages. It's completely untrue. So that measure passed about.
It's very cleverly titled then to appeal to a large number of people.
To be able to say, no, we are doing this for religious freedom. In Maine, we had question 1, which was a referendum on a state statute that happened on November 6th on Election Day. That was an act to allow marriage licenses for same-sex couples and protect religious freedom, again. The question that appeared on that ballot was, do you want to allow the state of Maine to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples? That law took effect on December 20th. It passed, obviously, and took effect on December 29th. And then we had Washington Measure 74, which, by the way, led to my absolute favorite photograph of this entire campaign, which hopefully we'll be able to show.
Okay.
This is Larry Duncan and Randy Shepard, who at about 1:30 in the morning, the marriage licenses were made available to them at midnight. They were in line. They got theirs at 1:30 in the morning. I love this picture. It destroys just so many of the stereotypes of the type of people who want to get married. These two guys have the most epic beards you will ever see. Hopefully you'll get a chance to see them. Larry Duncan and Randy Shepard. I have to smile every time I see this picture. But that also passed too. And so now we have same-sex marriage legal, and same-sex marriages have been happening now in Washington and in Maine and in Maryland since then. We also had Amendment 1 here in the state of Minnesota to forbid same-sex marriage. So we're a step behind here. We consider it, again, a religious issue. It was cloaked in the state of Minnesota as being, in the language of being something to protect children, in spite of complete lack of evidence of harm to children for this type of relationships. But what was very interesting in the state of Minnesota especially is it was approximately 90% of the non-religiously affiliated people supporting equal rights for marriage, which may have tipped the scales because it was a relatively close vote. It was 52% who voted against passing that amendment, which we're very happy with.
You caught me off guard there.
So we wanted to talk about church electioneering.
Yes, let's just move on to the next step with church electioneering. First, why don't you define what that is?
Well, churches are tax-exempt organizations, and as such, in the same way that Americans United is a tax-exempt organization, we have the right to speak out on ballot referenda, on issues. What we don't have the right to do is to endorse or oppose any candidate or party. This is not a freedom of speech issue. If a church wants to endorse a candidate or a particular party, they are free to do so, but only at the risk of losing their tax-exempt status. You can't have both. You can either be, you can either support a particular candidate or party, or you can be tax-exempt. You can't do both. Same laws apply to Americans United or any 501c3. The IRS says that they are enforcing these laws, but we really see no evidence of this. We've seen a lot of groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a right-wing group. They claim that over 1,500 churches openly supported particular candidates in this election year, which we find to be wrong. It's to have that kind of regulation that only works for one particular set of groups is really not the right way to do it.
But the IRS claims that they're
yes, and there's some
that?
debate right now about what's the right way to do that, and do they have the authority to do that, and how's the right way to accomplish it. But but the IRS has the authority to remove tax-exempt status from any group who does not follow the laws of the 501c3. And a lot of the members of the Roman Catholic hierarchy have been notably political this year, sometimes slyly and sometimes overtly, by urging their parishioners to vote for particular candidates. And they couch that in specific language. They say, vote for the candidate who will support this position. Now, there's only one candidate, or there was only one candidate in the 2012 elections that had openly expressed his support for same-sex marriage. There was only one candidate who was supporting a health care law that required organizations to pay for contraceptive health care. So when you make those statements and you say, vote for these religious principles, vote for the candidate that opposes same-sex marriage, vote for the candidate that opposes contraceptive care, then it's pretty clear who that is. Some of them are a little bit more overt than that. In 2010, we had here in the state of Minnesota, we had some electioneering complaints, people who were in the church actively saying Tom Emmer, or promoting Tom Emmer, specifically naming him. We also had Peoria, Illinois, we had a Roman Catholic bishop, Daniel Jenke, who was ordered priests in his diocese to read a letter to the parishioners the Sunday before the election, criticizing specifically the president for including contraception in the health insurance mandate, and calling parishioners to be faithful to Christ in their vote. And he was comparing Obama's policies to those of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. So obviously, stumping for a particular party. We also had bishops preaching that hellfire awaited those who voted for candidates that supported quote-unquote intrinsic evil, and included in the definition of things that were evil were same-sex marriage and abortion. And we had a sign outside a Texas church in 2012 that advised, vote for the Mormon, not the Muslim, the capitalist and not the communist.
Was that a Muslim church, or I'm sorry, a Mormon church?
No, it was not, but between the two, it was, I believe it was a Protestant church, but between the two, they definitely seem to prefer one candidate who was not the quote-unquote Muslim. A completely incorrect statement in the first place, but definite electioneering. And that does lead into another concern that we have, which is about using churches in general as a polling place. So it's a big concern, that electioneering from a tax exemption status, they are laws that apply to us. We try to follow them as closely as possible, and we believe that everybody who's a 501c3 should follow the same rules.
It sounds like the enforcement must be pretty weak if it's so flagrantly...
It is, and being defied.
Yeah,
so
being defied,
well.
yeah.
So it's a huge concern for us because, again, the rules are the rules, and while some will claim that that is an attack on religious freedom of expression, it's not. You have the right to express your support for a candidate, to express your support for a particular party. You cannot do it as a representative of an organization that has this particular tax-exempt status.
Okay. So then you were already talking that this kind of ties in with the fact that most of us go into a church to vote.
Yes, a lot of us do. And we do consider that problematic for a large number of reasons. It's very problematic, especially when there are religious issues on the ballot.
Yeah.
So in particular, in this election here in St. Paul and in Minneapolis, we had pictures of letters and posters that were in the areas where people were voting or where they were standing in line to vote. And these letters specifically put up for the election were calling for voters to consider their obligations to the church and consider their responsibilities as Christians. Now, clearly, coercion is a very significant probability in this kind of situation. When you're in this type of environment and there's a religious issue on the ballot, you are going to be primed to be thinking in a certain way by everything that's around you. And when there are letters and posters and marquees telling you should vote in a certain way, it really goes against the principles that we have, that electioneering should not be happening anywhere within, depending on the state you're in, 25, 50, or 100 feet of a polling place. Because it is very problematic. It leads to priming, it leads to coercion, it leads to people voting in the way that they might not have voted were the election to be held in a more neutral area. Now, there are no formal movements today to ban churches as polling places. It would probably be very controversial to do so. But at the same time, they are a clear problem, as they, more than anything else, because they associate the responsibilities of voting, which is a civic duty, democratic civic duty, with the obligations to a particular religion.
So why are churches so often used as polling places then?
They're very convenient. They are the meeting places for the communities in many situations, not the only meeting places. We believe that they are typically, in most places, enough non-religious places, public schools, public offices,
community centers,
community centers that could be used as those polling places that would not have that implication.
Yeah,
it's what's most troublesome is that implication that you somehow are conflating the responsibilities of democracy with one particular religious group. And I've had several conversations with people who say, this isn't a problem, we don't think about it when we're going into the church. And the question that generally kind of changes the subject is asking, well, how would you feel if, for example, you as a Christian had to go into a mosque to cast your vote, and you had to, in order to vote, you had to cast your vote under a banner that read, Allah is God and Muhammad is his only prophet. Would that make you feel welcome? Would that make you feel comfortable? Would that make you feel that this is okay? And in general, the conversation tends to change topic pretty quickly after that point. It's really about making sure everybody feels comfortable and welcome participating in a democracy that's pluralistic and that has multiple religions. And we feel that having the kind of displays that we saw a lot of in this election in November 2012, really, at the very least, is coercive, tends to prime people to think in a certain way, but can be very exclusionary and can make a lot of people feel very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So that's a big concern for us.
Did you have some examples in the Twin Cities specifically of issues using churches as polling stations?
Absolutely. In South St. Paul in Minnesota on Election Day, we had at the St. John Vianney Catholic Church, they were greeted with a banner right outside the polling place that read, "Strengthen marriage, don't redefine it." Absolute, very clear reference to the marriage amendment. Again, within the range of what we consider to be these exclusion zones for Election Day, where you're not supposed to have that kind of material. So it's very hard to have the church as a neutral polling place when the Catholic Church itself was so active during the entire electoral season for one particular side. We had West St. Paul St. Joseph's Church. There was a sign posted to the wall, which was right where they were standing in line to vote, and it was a prayer written by Twin Cities Archbishop John Neinstead, who was urging Catholics to defend God's plan for marriage, specifically between one man and one woman. Nobody who is a Catholic would be able to enter that church not knowing about this controversy. The Archbishop was very, very clear about what his position was, what he believed all of his bishops and all of the members of his diocese, what their positions should be. He was very clear that anybody who disagreed with him should remain silent. And to have that prominently displayed on Election Day in the actual place where people are voting is extremely problematic. And we had various issues, not just in the state of Minnesota, but in North Carolina, in Missouri, in Vincent, Ohio. There was, in the Assumption Church in St. Louis, Missouri, there's a polling place that put up anti-abortion signs and hundreds of crosses the week before Election Day. And there's a very similar display in Sacred Heart of Mary, which is a Catholic church in Boulder, Colorado. So a lot of places that would put up letters, posters, prayers, marquees, very specifically visible and without a doubt put there specifically for Election Day. So to prime people, to coerce them, and to say this is the way you should be voting, which is fine for them to do outside of the areas of polling places. Polling places must be neutral zones for that exact reason, to avoid this kind of priming and this kind of coercion. Priming is a very significant psychological effect. that will happen. Just the things you see on your way in, especially when you're within that 100 feet of that polling place, where we really don't want that. We want people to be able to go in, vote their conscience, and not feel that a representative of their deity is looking them over the shoulder.
Is there any recourse then if someone walks into a church and sees a sign that violates?
You can definitely complain to the Electoral Commission, yes. The problem is, especially on election day, it's hard to actually have something happen. There were some issues. It is problematic sometimes in other locations. You have a public school. I don't exactly remember the state, but there was a public school that had a giant mural of Barack Obama in the room where voting was happening. And it was a mural that had been there for quite some time. But it absolutely was problematic for the same reasons, coercion and priming. We don't claim that that was not a problem, but religious, a cross on the wall on top of where your voting is, they're both problematic. And this is the exact reason why we always say that kind of priming, that kind of coercion is what forces us to keep the electioneering pamphlets, posters, displays, anything like that outside of a certain radius of the electoral place. But it's impossible to do that in a church. If there are religious issues on the ballot, it's not possible to say, okay, we'll take down all the crosses and all the Bibles and all the saints on the walls. You can't do that for a church. It's just absolutely impossible to do. And we also have situations such as in Virginia, we had a voter voting at an Assemblies of God church who noticed that there were voter guides that were created by the Family Research Council. Significant opposition to same-sex marriage. Family Research Council focused on the family and the Family Foundation. And these apparently were about 20 feet from the polling booths. So very, very close to where people were voting. And the Reverend Barry Lynn, who's the executive director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, he had an opinion piece for CNN on Election Day. And he noted that part of the problem with voting in churches is that in many cases, the church has staked out a position on the issues that are on the ballot. His statement was, many churches and other houses of worship have taken stands on these issues and lots of others, which is their prerogative. Although federal law prohibits churches from endorsing or opposing candidates, they have the right to speak out on ballot referenda and other issues from abortion to zoning. But all of this church-based political activity makes me very uneasy about casting ballots in houses of worship, especially those that are festooned with political signs, which we saw a lot of in this election year.
So what's next then? We have about 5 minutes left. Maybe you can wrap it up.
Well, things are going to heat up.
Okay.
We really think so. I mean, 2014 is the next election season. The non-presidential elections tend to have a lower turnout. Tend to have a more extreme turnout, precisely because it's lower. The people who are more motivated, who tend to be more extreme on both sides of the fence, are the ones that tend to come out. So while we think that there was perhaps a lowering of that kind of extreme religiosity or appealing to religious groups and rejection of non-religious, non-affiliated people in the 2012 election, that was definitely a reduction in that from 2010. We think it may ramp up a little bit in 2014 as well. The other so that's just a natural consequence of these cycles of presidential versus non-presidential elections. But we're also reaching a point where the demographics are changing quite significantly. And for a lot of more fundamentalist, more extreme religious organizations, there's a very strong probability they may see this as last ditch. These are the last opportunities, which we believe is exactly what happened in the state of Minnesota. Acceptance of same-sex marriage has been increasing over time. The concept was, let's put it in the Constitution, and that way it'll stay there for years and years and years, no matter what the populace believes. It's kind of a last-ditch effort to let's get this in while we still have the votes to do so. So I think things are going to heat up because of that. So just as we see these groups attempting to impose these religious definitions of marriage, we think that that's going to spur the religious right into action over the next 2 years leading up to the 2014 elections. On other issues, we hopefully will see some resolution on these IRS responses to church electioneering. We definitely are planning to raise this as an issue in the state of Minnesota. It's not something we're very happy with, and we're not happy with what we see as the lack of response from the IRS as well. And also 2013 in particular is going to be a very interesting year with regards to the Supreme Court. We've got a couple of issues in front of the Supreme Court that they have decided to listen to regarding the DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, and also regarding the Proposition 8, which is the marriage amendment in the state of California. And we also have the very strong possibility of maybe 2 of the Supreme Court justices retiring over the course of the next 4 years.
Resulting in a change in the ideology of the court?
Depending on who retires,
okay.
Absolutely. I think that if you see Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Stephen Breyer, they choose to retire, they're going to be replaced by President Obama, probably with somebody with similar ideologies.
Sure,
They tend to vote very liberally. It would be very interesting to see Justice Kennedy, if he chooses to retire. He's been a relatively consistent swing vote over the years. He's 76, same age as Antonin Scalia, but we don't think Scalia is going to retire anytime soon for a variety of reasons. But that definitely has the possibility of changing the flavor of the court. And we're also really interested to see, especially after the Affordable Care Act was declared constitutional, what the future holds for Justice John Roberts. Because that was a bit of a surprise for quite a lot of us. So we'll have to see how he votes in the future. Hopefully, being an originalist, he will see the wisdom in the separation of church and state as defined in the First Amendment, and continue to support that throughout the years. So fingers crossed.
Yeah.
We'll definitely be working towards it.
So if our viewers or listeners on podcasts want to learn more, especially about Americans United, where can they go?
The Minnesota chapter is at mnau.org, and you can write to us on our email at info@mnau.org. Definitely they can visit the au.org website, Americans United website, for things that affect us nationally as well. Definitely they can sign up there as well. And when they do sign up, especially for the viewers here in the state of Minnesota, mention that they want to be members of the Minnesota chapter.
And then they're what, indentured into serving several hours?
Yes, then they will be forced to work in our camps.
All right. Well, these are exciting times.
Definitely.
As a result of the election and what the new legislature we have going on. So thank you for breaking it down for us, talking about the good points and the not so good points even.
Yes.
So, and we want to thank you, our viewers, for watching the show. If you would like to learn more about Minnesota Atheists, please contact us at the address you see on the screen. If you do, we'll send you a copy of our newsletter at no charge so you can learn more about us, because if you're interested in us, we're interested in you. Thank you.